All right. Good evening. First, thank you to all who are joining us virtually tonight via Zoom, via Facebook, whether you're viewing by yourself or with a friend or two. My name is Javonne Rich, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Director at the ACLU of Delaware, and I will be moderating tonight's event. So welcome to Access for All. What's next for reproductive rights and justice? With multiple cases pending at the US Supreme Court, state legislatures have been taking aim, and local municipalities weighing in on bans, and access to abortion is entering a new phase. So over the next hour, we are going to hear from national and state experts on the latest news from the courts and where reproductive rights stand in Delaware. Joining us tonight is Lorie Chaiten from ACLU National, Ruth Lytle-Barnaby from Planned Parenthood Delaware, Shané Darby from Black Mothers in Power, and Nick Beard from Delaware Now. After the speakers give presentations on their respective expertise, we will have a panel discussion or a Q&A. Just some housekeeping notes for tonight. The chat function has been disabled for tonight's event, but attendees can submit questions to panelists via Q&A, as well as comment on Facebook. And those questions will be asked during the Q&A portion towards the end of the program. So first, kicking us off is Lorie Chaiten, Senior Staff Attorney at ACLU National's Reproductive Freedom Project.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you tonight. It's a privilege to be here with all of you and the amazing advocates in Delaware who are working tirelessly to expand access to essential reproductive health care. I'm going to focus on the national landscape, which unfortunately, of course, has to start with last week's argument in the US Supreme Court. Last week's argument was in a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. The case presents a direct challenge to the nearly 49-year-old precedent protecting a person's right to terminate their pregnancy in the landmark case of Roe versus Wade. The law in Mississippi prohibits nearly all abortions after 14 weeks of pregnancy. The ban is a direct violation of the 1992 precedent set in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where the US Supreme Court made absolutely clear that a state may not prohibit any woman from making the ultimate decision to terminate her pregnancy before viability. The Mississippi 15-week ban is the latest in a long line of ever-increasing attacks on reproductive freedom. And the argument last week was nothing short of alarming. With the addition of 3 Trump appointees, the majority of the US Supreme Court now appears ready to allow politicians to control what we can do with our bodies and the future of our lives. There's no middle ground in this case. If the Supreme Court allows Mississippi's ban to stand, it will erase nearly 50 years of precedent. It will put abortion access at risk across the country. And in the words of Justice Sotomayor, it will create a stench in the public perception of the court and its legitimacy. And it's a slippery slope. Our right to abortion is not the only right at stake. As Justices Sotomayor and Kagan made clear during the argument, unraveling this right could lead to questioning other rights and liberties, like who we marry and how we form our families. A decision gutting or overturning Roe will put access to abortion on the line for everyone in America. Approximately half of the states are poised to ban abortion the minute the Supreme Court gives them clearance to do so. And make no mistake, anti-abortion politicians will also try to push a nationwide ban. Millions of people in this country could lose access, and the impact will be devastating. And as we all know, abortion bans and restrictions impose the most harmful burdens on Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities, people with disabilities, people in rural areas, young people, immigrants, and those who are struggling to make ends meet. Even if the court doesn't completely take away the right to abortion, any decision upholding the 15-week ban would so erode the right as to make it non-existent for vast numbers of people in our country. Indeed, even under Roe as we know it today, the right to abortion is simply not a reality for many. Over time, politicians have steadily pushed harsher and harsher abortion restrictions and policies, putting abortion out of reach for millions. Indeed, this year alone, 600 abortion restrictions have been introduced in the United States, which is a record. In addition to the horror of the arguments in the Mississippi case last week, we're still waiting for the US Supreme Court to step up and make clear that Texas and other states that seek to follow in its footsteps cannot use procedural maneuvers to eliminate access to abortion without even purporting to take on Roe. The court has let the Texas abortion ban, known as SB 8, remain in effect for more than 3 months, decimating access to abortion care in the state. The harm we're seeing in Texas right now is a case study of the dangers to come if the Supreme Court upholds the Mississippi ban and more states are allowed to roll back abortion rights. The Texas ban blocks abortion as early as 5 or 6 weeks of pregnancy, once cardiac activity is detectable. It allows vigilantes to sue abortion providers, clinic staff, and anyone who helps somebody obtain an abortion and collect a financial reward of $10,000 or more with no cap for every single abortion for each defendant. This law is designed to intimidate abortion providers and clinic staff from providing abortion care and to bully others from supporting people who need this care. Every day in Texas, patients who present with a pregnancy where cardiac activity is detectable are turned away and told their only option is to go out of state for care. Many have been forced to take time away from work and family and pay to travel hundreds of miles in order to cross state lines to a place where abortion is legal. And many others who are unable to make that journey have simply been forced to carry their pregnancies to term against their will. This is what it looks like when a state bans abortion, whether it's completely or at a particular point in pregnancy. It looks like a mother of 5 driving multiple hours with children in tow, only to learn that even though she's less than 6 weeks pregnant, there's cardiac activity, and therefore she cannot get an abortion without traveling out of state. It's an undocumented person who can't travel without significant risk, who is forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term. It's patients in neighboring states unable to get an appointment for an abortion for multiple weeks because the providers in those states, working as hard as they possibly can to meet the need, are overwhelmed as they attempt to absorb the influx of desperate patients forced to travel for basic health care. And it's not just Texas. Other states are poised to pass copycat laws. Indeed, a copycat with a complete abortion ban and the same procedural maneuvers and manipulations as in Texas was introduced this week in a special session of the Arkansas legislature. This all highlights 2 essential parallel tracks that we need to pursue. We need to push for proactive protective measures at the federal level and at the state level, wherever we possibly can. At the federal level, we have the Women's Health Protection Act, or what's known as WIPA, a federal bill that would establish a statutory right for healthcare providers to provide abortion care and for patients to receive such care, free from medically unnecessary restrictions and bans that single out abortion and cut off access. WIPA would create a new basis for courts to evaluate a wide range of laws that obstruct abortion care and provide additional tools to enable both the Department of Justice as well as individuals to fight harmful restrictions and bans. By enshrining the right to abortion, WIPA would make important progress toward ensuring that the right is a reality for everyone in our country, no matter where they live. The House has already passed this bill, and now it's the Senate's turn to take up this critical piece of legislation and do the right thing. We need to continue to push to assure that all barriers to access are removed at the federal level, and that includes long-standing medically unnecessary restrictions on access to medication abortion. Medication abortion is a safe and effective means of ending an early pregnancy. Millions of people have safely ended their pregnancies over the last 2 decades using the FDA-approved medication abortion regimen. Indeed, medication abortion now accounts for 60% of US abortions in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. In FDA's own words, the safety and efficacy of this medication is well established by research and experience, and complications are exceedingly rare. Nevertheless, FDA has long severely restricted where, how, and from whom this medication can be obtained. Most notably, FDA requires patients seeking medication abortion to travel needlessly to a medical facility for the sole purpose of picking up their medication that they can then take with them and take it in the privacy of their own homes, rather than allowing them to simply fill the prescription at a pharmacy, as we do with nearly all other drugs. These restrictions obstruct access to time-sensitive healthcare and deepen existing health inequities with no justification whatsoever. After 2 ACLU lawsuits and vast scientific research demonstrating the safety of medication abortion without these restrictions, FDA is currently undertaking a comprehensive review of its restrictions. We actually expect the review to be complete in the next week, and we call on the agency to follow the science, which is crystal clear, and to heed the calls of the leading medical organizations in our country by lifting these needless obstacles. Finally, we need to advance critical proactive measures in states like Delaware that protect abortion rights. We need to expand these protections not only for those who reside in these states, but for those who have to travel from other states that will no doubt take advantage of any door the Supreme Court opens for them to ban abortion in whole or in part. This means removing all barriers to access for all people, including young people, and removing restrictions on abortion coverage and limits on qualified healthcare professionals who can provide abortion care. We need to do all we can to ensure that everyone who needs access to this care can get it, if not in their home state, in a welcoming neighboring state that has capacity to ensure that all get the care they need. Thanks again for having me with you tonight.
Wow, thank you so much, Lorie, for sharing that knowledge. Some takeaways that I got from your presentation was how important elections are, right? So not federally, you're not just voting for the president, you're voting for their cabinet, you're voting for possible Supreme Court nominees who are going to make decisions like abortion or reproductive access. And then the second point that I take away is just hearing about the barriers if abortion bans or access to reproductive health care pass in your home state. So, for example, New York and California have made some ways stating that they would pay for people to get abortion access or reproductive health care access in their, in California or New York if someone doesn't have that access in their home state. But there's still going to be barriers there. You might have to pay to travel. There's going to be an influx of people from out of state, so those services may be slowed or delayed. So we really have to make sure that we're up ahead, ensuring that these bans and measures don't make headway. So thank you for that, Lorie.
Thank you. And yeah, absolutely. Elections at every level, right? I think we're going to hear about some community level political activity at the local, state, federal level. Every election counts and it's essential. And in addition, I think ramping up capacity in places like Delaware that protect abortion access will become important as patients have to travel more. So thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So next, we are going to hear from Ruth Lytle-Barnaby, who is the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood. Ruth is going to be talking about the state of access to reproductive health care in our state, Delaware, as well as ideas for expansion. Ruth?
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I think we'll start first with talking about some of the good things that have happened in Delaware. In 2017, the Delaware General Assembly codified Roe v. Wade into state law. It removed some archaic language that really allowed us to ensure that abortion access is going to be here for us regardless of what happens nationally. In 2021, just this last session, lawmakers also removed some outdated portions of the criminal code that made abortion a crime, criminalized a self-managed abortion, criminalized the ability to even buy supplies used in an abortion. So we are really grateful for both of those things and know that that's really going to make a difference for not just Delawareans, but people from other states seeking abortions. Guttmacher, in their 2020 report, did struggle with us a little bit, though, because we don't allow Medicaid to cover abortions, and because we also require parental notification for minors. There is a way around this for minors with permission from the courts, though the actual process is pretty laborious and difficult for teenagers to manage. Overall, Delaware is a good place, better than most states, to be able to have abortion access. NARAL considers DARAL to be protecting abortion rights, but also believes we have room for improvement around who can provide abortion. Right now, it's a physician-only state, and legal protections for clinics and patients against protesters. This requires the protections are really needed because our protesters are getting more volatile as time goes on, and we are always working for additional security to protect our staff and our patients. They would like to see more Medicaid funding for abortion, and that we should have an abortion guarantee in our Constitution. Good news, our Attorney General, Kathy Jennings, strongly supports reproductive rights, as do other champions in the legislature, and we are so grateful for their backing. On the more difficult side of what's going on, even though every single session since I've been with Planned Parenthood of Delaware, there have been attempts to restrict access, to limit access, to really create shame and barriers for our patients. Right now, our biggest issue is in Seaford. We opened a new clinic there just a few weeks ago, and Seaford a few months ago tried to pass a restrictive ordinance that required fetal remains to be buried or cremated. Early on, they backed down after our state Department of Justice and ACLU threatened to sue them, but now they brought it back up and are set for a reading and a vote for that in this upcoming council meeting on Tuesday. We are confident that the ordinance has clear legal issues that would cause it not to stand up in court, but we would certainly not like to go down that route if possible. Two areas where we could make improvements. One is with abortion provider expansion. Right now, abortion practice is for doctors only. There's really no reason for it to be this way, but it does make it harder for patients and limits access. Studies from the University of California in San Francisco and the National Institute of Health show us that abortions are basically exactly as safe when performed by medical professionals other than doctors as when compared to physicians. So who are we talking about being able to provide this? We're talking about advanced practice nurses and physician assistants. Right now, there are 14 states plus DC that allow non-doctors to perform all types of abortions, and 4 states allow non-doctors to perform medical abortions. We have confidence in legislative support for this, and the Delaware Academy of Physicians are also on board. The Delaware Nurses Association is bringing this up with their membership, but the physician assistant group has also endorsed this as well. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists also support this as well. So we are hopeful that we can bring something up about this in the next session. The other areas with Medicaid funding for abortions, we don't believe that that's likely right now, but we do believe that we can build support for that over the next few years. Right now, 16 states have policy that directs Medicaid to pay for all or most all of medically necessary abortions. And right now we have court-ordered states that also provide for this as well. The last area that I believe that we could really use some help and maybe some legislative work is with crisis pregnancy centers. Those of you that don't know what those are, crisis pregnancy centers are usually set up near clinics that provide abortions, and they are there to talk women into maintaining their pregnancy. Unfortunately, it's often done with deceptive and dangerous tactics. False ultrasounds can be used. Telling people that they're further along than they are, not giving women access to medically important information, and it's just not regulated. Basically, practicing medicine without a license. Our goal would be to find provisions that could help women understand that if they go to a crisis pregnancy center, that they would know exactly what it is they're going to and the kind of information that they receive. So that's the kind of temperature check right now in Delaware. Some things going really well, areas for improvement, and areas where we think we can make a big difference in the lives of the women in Delaware and the folks that are bound to come see us if some or part of Roe gets overturned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Could you speak more to, some people would say Delaware is a blue state, and we've really applauded ourselves for being better than most states when it comes to reproductive health care and access. Can you speak more to why it is still important that we stay engaged in our local elections, ensuring that we can keep those rights and access?
Sure. Codifying Roe was a great thing, and it was done because of the strong legislative support that we have. Some of the anti-bills that come up on a regular basis we could have a different story in Delaware if we had a different legislature. And I think it's really important to know that we have the support right now, but continued voting is what keeps that support for us and for abortion rights strong in Delaware.
Thanks again. And for those who may have joined us a little bit later, just a reminder, the chat is closed. However, if you have any questions, feel free to insert them into the Q&A portion if you're on Zoom, or in the comment section on Facebook, and we will ask those questions later on in the program. Up next, we have Shané Darby, founder of Black Mothers in Power. Shané is going to be speaking on what's the state of reproductive justice in Delaware, as well as how can access for Black, Indigenous, and people of color be increased?
Yes, thank you guys for having me. When I look at the state of reproductive justice now, I think it's slow, stagnant, it's small progress happening here in the state of Delaware. And when I say this, because I think of it in this way, I think that when we talk about like infant mortality rates, right? And Black babies are dying at higher rates. And this has been happening for decades. It's not like it's new. It just came up a year or two ago. And action still hasn't been taken, right? I don't feel like it's being taken seriously. And even though the conversations are happening and small progress is happening, I think like the emergency piece behind it on like something needs to happen now. We have the data, we have the information, we know what needs to happen. We don't need another meeting to happen to talk about the solutions that we know need to happen again, right? So I just don't feel like, for me, from my perspective, that reproductive justice is happening at the rate that it should be happening. I feel like if we were to switch the numbers and let's say white babies start to become the ones who are dying at higher rates, then I believe there would be more emergency and fire put under people's butt to get things done. So what is reproductive justice, right? So reproductive justice was a term coined in the 90s by a group of Black activists. And when I first heard of reproductive justice, I actually learned about it actually from a group of white women. I did not realize that reproductive justice was a term coined by Black women, by Black activists, until I started doing my own research. And it's basically like just focusing on the human right to be able to make decisions about your body, right? Either to have children, not to have children, to parent, whatever way you see fit, right? That fits what you want to do, right? And what was so key or important about this is that at the time you have reproductive right movements happening, right? And most of the time they were only about abortion, and it was pro-choice versus pro-life, and it was really white women centered. And the reproductive justice part is more about focusing and addressing intersecting factors that impacts women's choices, right? So what does it look like to be a Black woman trying to get abortion access, or a Black woman with a disability, or a Black woman who is a lesbian, right? So looking at the intersecting factors of like class, gender, sexuality, is looking at like all the ways that we identify, right? And like looking at that from like a social justice framework for reproductive rights and health. That is what reproductive justice is about. It's not just about, oh, we want to have abortion rights, but no, how do we break those barriers that exist? And how do we center the most marginalized groups of people when we're talking about reproductive health, when we're talking about reproductive rights in our state or across the nation, right? So Delaware, I feel like, can just do better. And my focus really for Black Mothers of Power is more infant mortality rates. And I say that because you have hospitals who are a part of the problem talking about creating a doula training program. Well, not doula training program, but having a doula affiliated list where they approve doulas to work in their hospitals or to service women in the community. Problematic. We don't need systems trying to participate in that solution when they are the problem, right? We need to really address that. It's racism, it's implicit bias. Those are the issues or problems. Why don't we address that within the hospitals, right? Or you have some programs or groups want to design a program with UD students to be birth companions instead of focusing on the issue, which is the racism, implicit bias, the issues when Black women go into these hospitals, the systemic racism that we have faced since the enslavement of that started here with for Black people back in 1619. So those things are really important for me, for Delaware to really focus on and do better in reproductive justice. I think that we're moving slowly along, but I just don't think we're really like going at it with like, this is serious. Black babies are dying at high rates. It's just not, I'm not hearing it. And it can be frustrating and empowering all at once, because it makes me continue to push to do this work, to say we are here. Our babies matter, our communities matter, our family matters. But then when I hear that other Black women who come before me have been talking about this for decades, I don't want to talk about this for decades. I don't want my daughter to turn 32, having her baby, and she is still fighting for the same thing. And we're all saying, oh, this is an issue, but not that much of an issue, not that important for us to make sure that Medicaid reimbursement happens for doula services. And then let's not make sure that doctors have implicit bias and racism training at the hospitals, right? We're not implementing those things. And this has been going on for decades. This is nothing new. So that's why I think reproductive justice in Delaware has not happened, because it's not new information and much has not changed. So specifically when we talk about abortions, what I think is so key in regards to Black women, Indigenous people, like specifically, how do we increase access, right? And I think it's really important to understand what the issue is, to like, what are the issues amongst Black women, Indigenous, people of color, right? It's really looking at the issue specifically for Black women. At every income level, Black women have higher abortion rates because we have higher rates of unintended pregnancies. And a lot of people will use like, oh, you know, very negative stereotypes. Maybe Black women are hypersexual and always have sex, right? Or they'll blame like marketing and think marketing is making Black women get more abortions than anyone else, when really we have to look at the lack of access to contraception for certain communities, right? And safe contraceptions for Black women, because that's another conversation that doesn't happen, on how some contraceptions that work for white women don't really work for Black women. We have different issues, right? So having those conversations about access, about what works for Black women's bodies when you're doing these tests or studies and developing contraceptions, and you use only white women and Black women are included in those studies, but then you expect for it to work for us. Those are the issues or problems we have to look at when we're looking at why Black women have higher rates of abortion, why abortion access could also be an issue in that community because of the lack of access to contraception, because of the lack of access to affordable health insurance, childcare, paid time off for Black women when it's time for us to, when we have our babies. I don't want to have a baby and then have to go back to work in 2-3 weeks because I don't have paid time off or leave to be able to stay home with my family, right? So a lot of these things that certain people don't have access to helps to contribute to the access to abortion, the quality, right, are so important. And another thing to hit on is the high mistrust of the healthcare system in the Black community contributes to that, right? And then systemic racism impacts on health outcomes. Or the list can go on about abortion access and care specifically for Black women, and even looking at Indigenous communities or people of color where we don't have the same access, we don't have the same quality, and we don't have the same health outcomes because we're Black, because we're Indigenous, because we are people of color, because systemically what has happened in this country that still has a negative effect on us. So I feel like Delaware has a long ways to go for me. And I really need to see a little bit more fire, a little bit more urgency on some of these issues. I feel like if the tables were turned, it would be so much urgency and fire if white babies were faced with the same infant mortality rate, if these things were switched when we talk about reproductive justice, that these conversations would look really different. So Black women are really just fighting for control over our bodies. If we want an abortion, don't want an abortion, right? And finding ways to also, while we're a part of this conversation, while we're talking about reproductive rights, we're also talking about reproductive justice. We're talking about how do we identify and articulate what our needs are for us, for our families, and for our communities. So I want to say thank you guys for having me. The conversation, I can go on and on, but I only have a few minutes. But those are some of the points I have about where we are, the state of reproductive justice for our state, and then also like how to increase it. And that's really focusing on the reasons why abortion access and quality is reduced for Black women, Indigenous, or people of color. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Shané. Big fan here, first of all. So, and I do love that you elevated the definition of reproductive justice, right? It's not just a debate about the morality and legality of abortion. It's about people's ability to autonomously make decisions about what, if they're going to have children, when they're going to have children, maybe they're not going to have children, but also parenting too. Just a quick question for you. You talked about, the infant mortality rate and how that relates to, or is, reproductive justice. But I've also heard you talk about other elements that is also a part of the conversation of reproductive justice that other folks might not ever think is important to advocate for, such as, folks who are incarcerated and pregnant. Could you speak more to, some other areas of advocacy that is needed in this reproductive justice work?
Yeah, I can hit on so many things. Like for me, I think really we call ourselves a blue state. I think we're really not. I think we're a red state. Like we say we're a blue state. Even when it comes to basic conversations of talking about, even me, when I use birthing people instead of women, people are confused. And even when I try to explain to them, why do I say birthing people? Because all people who give birth don't identify as a woman, right? So like even conversations around that, and when I go into rooms, I say maybe we should use birthing people instead of birthing women. Even in the rooms today of like doctors and hospitals, and I'm trying to tell them like maybe we should use more inclusive words. That is still like an issue for a lot of people, right? And I think it was so key that you brought up birthing people who are incarcerated, because that is so key for our state. And I think it's important that we understand how it is even more, the issue is even more for someone who is Black, pregnant, and incarcerated, right? I couldn't even imagine being pregnant, incarcerated, and they take your baby from you, or being shackled, right? So shackling is actually illegal in Delaware. They don't shackle, but however, when they're transporting, they do. And it's under the discretion of their of the CO that they're with, the correctional officer, if they will be shackled or not. So there's loopholes to it. So we're not going, it's illegal, but there's 2 loopholes in the shackling code law here in Delaware, which is so key and important to try to tackle those on a state level, because incarcerated people, I don't think should be shackled in any situation. And who, when they're giving birth, is trying to escape. Like if you are trying to escape while giving birth, you just let them go at that point, because giving birth is no joke. But those are really key and important conversations. So
Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, if you have any questions, on Zoom, there's a Q&A section, and we'll be taking questions from the comments on Facebook. Now to our last but not least, our next speaker is Nick Beard. Nick Beard is the, sorry, y'all, let me get my notes. Nick Beard is the chair of Delaware Now, which stands for Delaware's National Organization for Women. And Nick is on the Reproductive Justice Task Force. So Nick, it's your moment.
Yeah, as I said, I have strongly worded whoever has me follow Shané, as she is a hard act to follow. But I think in light of what she said, it's important to acknowledge that while I'm here discussing the access to abortion services for young people, that a lot of reproductive options for young people are really halted, that they can often struggle to continue a pregnancy that they would like to, due to economic reasons, due to lack of social support. And so it's important that we do acknowledge that often young people don't have as many full and free options as we would like. That reproductive justice means they can choose to access an abortion, or they can choose to parent. So with that acknowledgement, I will say that about a year ago, I became really interested in, as Ruth spoke about earlier, parental notification and judicial bypass. So Javonne always tells me I need to make sure that I'm defining those terms. And anyone under 17 in Delaware who chooses to access abortion services needs to notify one of their parents. Otherwise, they need to go through the court system. And this means going to family court. There's one per county. So particularly in somewhere like Sussex, they might not live anywhere near that family court, and submitting an application to a judge to have the judge deem them as mature enough to make their own decision without needing to notify their parents. Now, I don't know about you, but I still find court a little bit intimidating as a grown adult who has passed the bar. And I cannot imagine being 15 years old and needing to get myself to a court and fill out one of those forms. So as I've been speaking to people about this experience, stories of people who have gone through this process have emerged. Obviously, a lot of teenagers do have parents who they can discuss their decision with, who they can talk through about their reproductive options, who, even if they are not supportive of abortion, are able to be a sounding board for their children or make a decision as a family. Unfortunately, that is not true for every person under the age of 17. So there are people who, for example, are caretaker for the parents. So someone I spoke to discuss a minor who was looking after her elderly grandmother, who was her guardian. and was worried about getting the consent from her grandmother, who was already dealing with health issues. Another, while technically in the care of her mother was no longer in the picture, and she was living informally with other relatives. So I think it is important to acknowledge that there are situations where parents are not always someone who are safe people in their lives. There are also people whose parents are abusive, person who a friend or family member might be the source of the pregnancy. And so it is just not safe for them to confide about the pregnancy or about the abortion. So we've have some great national research on what that does. And so the Guttmacher Institute, who has done quite a bit of work on this, has noticed that there are several results to having notification laws such as this. Minors have to travel farther to access an abortion. And remember, when you're a teenager, traveling far can be quite difficult. That often means that they access abortion services later than they would have liked to, and therefore that it's more expensive. It's also important to acknowledge that even if you are able to get a judicial bypass, there's often the worry about your health insurance. Many of us are on our parents' health insurance. When I was a teenager until 22, now it's 26. And while places like Ruth and Planned Parenthood do a great job of ensuring that health insurance isn't always a barrier, it can certainly seem like a barrier when you're considering accessing abortion services. We've also found that there's a really irregular access of being aware of this option. Most of you are probably saying, I never heard of parental notification and I never heard of judicial bypass until tonight. You are not alone. People who work closely with teenagers can also not be aware of it. One of the things we did learn is that there are some students who are able to access it through their school wellness center. And so when counselors and trusted adults in someone's life are aware of the information and can provide support, that makes a big difference. So I think it is important to acknowledge that in situations where a parent can't be a counselor and can't provide information, that other trusted adults in their life should be aware of these options, should be able to discuss judicial bypass, and should be able to provide them with information about their legal rights. So in addition to that, it's important that when we are looking at what does this actually mean access-wise, that we are discussing things like the travel that has to take place in Sussex, that we are discussing things like access to health insurance and access to affordable abortions, and that we are really looking at access to information. The information has meant that the world can never seem smaller sometimes with the internet, but sometimes that means that the information isn't good, isn't accurate, and can be confusing. Ruth made a great point about crisis pregnancy centers that can sometimes give inaccurate information to someone. And if you are unable to talk to someone and only relying on the internet, that can put you in a very confusing place. So that is the research I'm doing. We are actually working on a report discussing more in depth, particularly some of the racial discrepancies that this has meant for access to abortion services. But as I said, I'm so happy to be sharing a virtual stage with these people. And I'm excited for the idea that in Delaware, there's more we can do, that we can better educate trusted adults in teenagers' lives, that we can look whether or not this notification requirement is actually doing what we want it to do and helping teenagers speak to safe adults, and making sure that we respect the reproductive options of teenagers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for your work. Obviously, we've been working together on this, and I dug into it a little bit, not an expert. But what I found profound was that, the courts are deciding, like making a young person's like healthcare decision in a sense. And then, I'm guessing that they're kind of judging whether or not a young person is mature enough to make that decision themselves. But it sounds like the conversation is, are they mature enough to receive or have access to an abortion, or are they mature enough to, follow through with their pregnancy, not wanting to and then raise a child. So I don't understand why, we're not expanding this access to young people. Could you speak more to, the statement that I just made?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've made a great point, which is that they don't keep records. So we are not able to know if there are judges who are turning these down. We don't know if there's a difference based on whether or not someone lives in Newcastle or Sussex. We don't know. And so that is concerning, because you're right, there is no magic option that they can pick, which says, actually, pause the clock, you're not going to parent, you're not going to access an abortion, your life will not change. The reality is that those are the options: to continue the pregnancy or to access abortion services. And so in that situation, the idea of a judge looking at the maturity that someone has, and granted, this might not be someone who understands the struggles that this young person has been in. As I said, this might be someone who has limited English, who is a migrant, who is caretaking their adult relatives, who might not have parents who are actively involved. The idea that a judge is literally judging that is difficult. And the idea of just putting that barrier of someone who tells you whether or not you are grown up and mature is really anathema to our idea of empowering young people.
Great, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you. You'll get more things, but thanks to all of our panelists tonight for coming prepared with information. And so now we enter the Q&A portion of tonight. So if you have any questions during this time, said it like 5 million times, but Q&A section on the Zoom, but also we'll be taking questions from Facebook. So one question that I want to open for Shané or Nick. We talked, I know Shané talked with us about reproductive justice, but can we kind of, give the audience a more clear idea about what's the difference between reproductive health care and reproductive justice and why that matters?
Shané, do you want to take it? You're a rock star.
No, you can go.
So I think it's important to acknowledge that, yes, Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a Black academic, came up with this metaphor of intersectionality being a traffic accident that happens at a crossroads. And you don't always know if it's because you're Black or you're a woman, because so much of it is related. And I think Shané's work with Black Mothers in Power shows how it's not just enough to say you can have abortion or you cannot have abortion. If you're not going to support someone in parenting, then it's not a real choice, is it?
Yeah, and I think you hit on some great things. And just when I think of just healthcare rights, we're just saying, do you have the right to do it or not? Simply, like, do you have that right? And then reproductive justice goes into the social justice framework of that. Like, okay, I can get an abortion, but I don't have the money to pay for one, right? Or I don't have the health insurance, or I don't have different things that will stop access to those things and create barriers is what what reproductive justice is about. How do we get through those layers to make sure women really do have the option or the choice to have access to abortion or whatever the reproductive topic is. So, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we had a question from a viewer tonight. Ruth, could you answer this next question? Could you talk a little bit about what happens to Delaware if Roe is repealed outright? So what would that mean for Delawareans?
Well, there still are state rights, and I think that would be certainly the beginning of the end for many states. And we're looking at least 24 states that could repeal abortion altogether in their own state. Some have things all teed up, ready to go. So it does make, though, things like the Women's Health Protection Act vital, because that really is like codifying Roe for the country. And that would usurp some of the Supreme Court decision making. But I think we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared about what momentum gets built from that and what that would mean for people in all states and in Delaware as well.
Wonderful. And since we have you, Ruth,
Mhm.
could you talk more about, well, we know an often overlooked fact about Planned Parenthood is the wide range of services that are provided there.
Mhm.
So could you talk more about those healthcare services, as well as tell the viewers where they can find information on all of those healthcare services?
Sure. So we provide, the biggest thing we do is provide birth control. So, and we do that because we want people to decide if and when they decide to start a family. And so between birth control, STD testing, cancer screens, pap smears, gender affirming care, what else? We have all kinds of prenatal care offerings, sex education. We have, in particular, sex ed targeted to adults with intellectual disabilities. We have colposcopy. We have a number of services. 96% of what we do is all of the things I just mentioned, but we also proudly provide abortion services, and we do it to help anybody who comes to us, anybody with a uterus that comes to us, shame-free and guilt-free on their part, and that our goal is to support decision-making, not to be the decider for others of what they will or won't do. So lots of different services. And I would say birth control is probably the biggest thing that we do.
Wonderful, thank you. And the next question is for, well, you know what? I'm going to open it up to some of our Delaware experts on this, because I'm not quite sure who's working on it. But could anyone speak to if there's a movement to make contraception more available and for free?
I could start. One of the great things about the state of Delaware is its interest in contraceptive access. So Delaware had a great partner with Upstream, who came in and really wanted to validate their belief that people could have a stronger economic future if they decided if, when, how many kids they wanted to have, and make a difference in that way. And they actually influenced some economic stability factors. They influenced the rate of unintended pregnancy. There was lots of great things they did. Delaware, when that program ended, took on birth control access with DCAN, Delaware Contraceptive Access Now. So clinics like mine are able to provide birth control at a sliding scale. So you might pay nothing, and you might pay what the retail rate is based on income and other factors. So we actually do right now have some free birth control out there and available through clinics like Planned Parenthood, Westside Health Center. A lot of the federally qualified health centers provide that kind of a service. So the good news is we have some of that. And also shifting direction for people being able to get birth control pills anyway, or a depot shot at their pharmacy if they don't have a prescription yet. So two great things that allow more choice, more availability, and greater access.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Lorie, the next question is for you. And I'm wondering, you know, if you're able to answer the question, but could you talk a little bit, because you and I have kind of had a conversation about it. Could you talk a little bit more about what it means to be an ally, so an allied organization versus a reproductive justice organization?
So yeah, and I would say I'm happy to pass this one over to others who are working in the reproductive justice movement. And so I don't want to take the space from those who are actually the experts. But I personally feel strongly about the need to be clear that, for example, I work for an organization that works for reproductive freedom, and we are an allied organization to reproductive justice organizations. We are not led by BIPOC people. We support reproductive justice, and we support the intersectionality that reproductive justice advances. But we are very clear that we are not a reproductive justice organization. We don't presume to take on that label, given the work that we do, which is really focused on we focus on rights, and we focus on access. We focus on access issues in a way that is very supportive of the reproductive justice movement. But there's a difference. And I would obviously love to hear from others on the panel about this issue as well, because I think it's something that folks sometimes get confused about.
Is anyone else dying to also take a stab at that question? All right, and our last question for tonight, and Lorie, this is a question for you again. Are these local anti-abortion ordinances like what we're seeing in Delaware, where they're requiring burials or cremation of fetal remains, like what you are seeing on a national trend? Like, what else are you seeing that may not ban abortion access outright, but is obviously working to impede access?
So the idea of a local ordinance, restricting access to reproductive health care, to abortion in particular, is something that we are seeing. There's definitely a national trend where communities around the country are attempting, in lots of places, they don't even have an abortion provider in the community, but they nevertheless pass these ordinances. And sometimes they pass them, or they try to pass them, as we're seeing in Delaware, in response to the fact that Planned Parenthood or another organization is trying to increase access. Most of them that I have seen, though I can't say I've done a complete survey, have actually been focused a lot more on banning abortion rather than on this notion of fetal tissue disposal, though we have seen those kinds of ordinances or those kinds of restrictions passing on a statewide level, because it makes it it sometimes makes it impossible to provide abortion care. And as a result, it is a barrier that is essentially a ban, but they put a different name on it. And I think, Ruth, you may have more to add to that.
Yeah, I think what we see in Planned Parenthood world that covers all 50 states are that there's a couple different levels of the ordinances or bills that are coming up in different states. And I know in the past 18 months, there were over 600 brought up, and a couple of hundred of them passed. So the level of restriction just gets bigger and bigger all the time. It can be anything from waiting periods, which do nothing but harm people of low income, to that they have to wait, go back to a clinic. They're missing time away from work, from their families. They might not have daycare. It reeks of racism and classism and all the other isms you might think of, to things like mandatory ultrasound, and you have to listen to a fetal heart tone, which are in many cases absolutely unnecessary. So it drives up cost for people that can ill afford the driving up of cost. It causes people to wait, and it basically is shaming women. And most of these kind of legislative tactics are really the trying to make abortion just unfeasible for most people. So you give up before you ever even consider that as an option.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. Well, that concludes our Q&A portion. It actually concludes the night. We made it. But I really appreciated our panelists this evening for, again, lending their expertise tonight. I want to thank everyone who's viewing, who's been with us so far. And I also would like to thank a few of my colleagues who've been working behind the scenes to make sure that this event goes off. That includes Mike Brickner, Priya, Hey Chatterjee, Melissa Bryson. Thank you so much for your support tonight. But of course, we're going to have a call to action because there's a need for action this week. So something that we alluded to during this session is an ordinance in Seaford. So on December 14th, so next week at 7 p.m., Seaford City Council will vote on a proposed ordinance that would restrict abortion access by requiring patients and clinics to follow medically unnecessary rules regarding the disposal of fetal remains. The proposed ordinance is, another version of the types of anti-abortion legislation that we've talked about tonight, that we've seen in other states. So we are encouraging our viewers to email, call Seaford City Council board members to let them know that we will not stand for impeding access. The folks who are registered via Zoom, we will be sending out an email tomorrow or early Monday with more information on how you can partake in a letter writing campaign. And those who are viewing on Facebook, you obviously are following us, so stay tuned for more information about how you can take action in that arena as well. So what a great night. My biggest takeaway from tonight is that beyond the uncertainty of what may be next, there's still hope, and I hope that you feel the same way. Have a good night. See you next time.